I like to start talking about the productive struggle by using a weightlifting analogy. So, in this picture, she's lifting a weight that is challenging but not impossible. It's not too easy, it's not too hard. And the man is supporting her. He's not lifting the weight for her, which is going to be the main focus of this video. Because if he were lifting the weight for her, then she would not be able to grow. And even though it's difficult, lifting something that is challenging for her will help her grow. So let's talk about the struggle. This occurs when your child is trying to work through a problem and they're having a hard time. So instead of directly telling them exactly what to do, we're going to talk about some strategies that you can use to help them be supported as they work through a math problem instead of just receiving the answer from you. So this promotes personal responsibility because the child is responsible for their own learning. It also helps you to see their thinking. And sometimes when students are having some sort of issue, it's not necessarily that they don't understand the entire concept. They might just need a little bump in one direction. It also leaves room for creativity because if you're telling a child how to solve every problem, then they're not able to think about how they might solve the problem. They might come up with something that is unique and still works that you may not have thought of. So let's get started. So the productive part of the struggle is that you aren't just saying, I'm leaving you at the table, I'm walking away. You're kind of helping to scaffold or support them through whatever issue that they're having. So, first, you can ask them to explain what they're thinking or ask them to explain what they were taught in class. So, you could take on the role as a student and say, can you teach me how to do this so that I better understand? Or what were you thinking when you were doing this part? You can also set up a simpler problem. So setting up a simpler problem is a strategy that we use a lot in class, and then we relate it back to a more difficult problem. So doing that allows the student to start to see some patterns in math. And I'll go through examples of all of this. And then the last thing, of course, is just praise effort, keep it positive. If you're working at home on homework, homework is meant to be done independently. It's not worth much of the student's grade for that purpose because I can't be there to help them. So you just want to praise the effort and keep it positive and don't turn it into a very negative situation where the child is fearful of failure. So let's start here. So we have this multiplication problem, 23 times 6, and the child has selected to do this strategy, which is the area model. So the child's doing this and they are getting the wrong answer. So instead of saying like, I don't know what you're doing, you're getting the wrong answer. I'm going to just show you the way I learned it. I don't understand this. So you just need to learn this other way. Instead of doing that and seeing, they've got the wrong answer, they have 30 for 23 times 6. That doesn't make sense. So you could say, okay, if we have 23 groups of 6 or 6 groups of 23, would it make sense for that to be 30? They'll say, no, it doesn't. Then you can start to go through some of these other options. So, okay, I'm looking at what you did. Can you explain what you did first? Why did you write that 12? You could say, oh, a simpler problem. What about 23 times 2? So that's less than times 6, but we know 23 times 2 would just be 23 plus 23, which is 46. So already we can see that your answer doesn't make sense. Maybe we can look at an addition example. So here I have the 23 times 6 right now as an addition problem, and the student could see, okay, I'll be adding 3 6s, so that's 18. That's what I have in my first box. And then over here, those are 6 2s, but since it's in the tens place, it's actually going to be 120. And then that might help the student to get the right answer. So instead of shutting the student down and saying, you aren't doing this strategy correctly and I don't understand it and I'm not going to try to understand it, you could ask them a few questions. You might be able to better figure out what they're thinking. So if they're coming home and they're trying to do this area model, it's because that's what they chose to do in class because that's what made more sense to them at the time. So we want to make sure that we're supporting them in the strategy that works best for them And just because they had written a 12 in that box does not mean they completely don't understand the entire strategy. It could just be a simple error. Okay, let's do another one. So we're comparing the two fractions. We've got 5/6 and 5/8. If the student is stuck, they're a little confused, instead of saying, when the numerators are the same, you go with the bigger denominator. That's a rule that might not make sense to the student. So that's something that as adults, we understand we have a lot of experience with fractions, but to a student who's working with fractions for the first time, they really need to understand what the numerator means and what the denominator means. And just giving them sentences like this to memorize does not really help with their understanding of the concept. So later on, they will develop this understanding, but when they are starting out, this is very confusing. So let's look at some other strategies we could use. Okay, I've got some fraction tiles here. What do you notice about how big the sixth pieces are versus the eighth pieces? It looks like the sixth pieces are bigger, so what could that tell us? What about if we drew a picture like this circle diagram? I've got 5/6 on the left and 5/8 on the right. What can we tell about that? A simpler problem. What about if it was 4/6 and 4/8? Then what would it look like? So those sorts of questions and using a visual can really help the student to understand what they're doing instead of just giving them some rule to memorize that if they forget that rule, then they have no idea what to do. That's what we want to avoid. All right, so there is such a thing as too much help. It is difficult to watch a child struggle. So definitely, um, it's not fun when a student is struggling and they're having a hard time. However, when they struggle, then they're starting to build more connections. They're starting to be in charge of their own learning. You want to empower them to ask questions in class if they don't understand. So if you're having a hard time at home and you're trying different strategies, then they need to be empowered to ask questions in class. And of course, part of my job is monitoring the students as well, which I do on a constant basis to make sure that they're understanding what they are doing. So I'm able to help in class, you're able to help at home, and then the student is also responsible for trying to learn and asking questions if they don't understand.